Goedenavond iedereen, good evening everybody and welcome bij de Zoom van CIDI. Ik ben Ghana Louden, directeur van CIDI. En ik ben heel blij om vandaag Dr. Einat Wilf bij ons te hebben. En Einat Wilf, very welcome to our Zoom at CIDI. We are happy to have you here with us. I will hold a very short introduction before giving Einat the floor. Einat will give us a short lecture about the topic of the Palestinian refugees in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict related to the book which has just come out in English. I must tell you, I have read this book in Hebrew a few years ago and was very excited and waited for the moment the book will be published in English, and now we are there. We just discussed the fact that it was very difficult to arrange a lecture with Einat coming over to the Netherlands. So the Zoom is for both of us a very good opportunity to have Einat here after so many attempts in the past, which agenda-wise or planning-wise was very difficult. So some things happen with the corona pandemics, which are positive probably. And of course, all of us have more time to read interesting books. After a lecture Einat will hold, we will have a time for questions and answers. And those who connected to us via Zoom will probably know that there is a small button underneath your screen, which is called Q&A. And that's where you can pose any question you want to Einat regarding our topic of today. I will do my best to read and select the questions and pose them to Einat. Before I give you the floor, Einat, I want to introduce you shortly. Dr. Einat Wilf is an author and leading thinker on matters of foreign policy of Israel, on economics, on education, on Israel in general, and about the topic of Zionism. She was a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, in the years 2010, 2013. And she served as chair of the education committee and as a member of the very important committee, of course, in Israel of foreign affairs and defense, compared to the BUSA committee in the Netherlands. Dr. Wilf has a bachelor's degree from Harvard and MBA from INSEAD, from the European Management Institute, and her PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She's the author of 6 books, and today she will talk to us about her latest book, The War of Return, how Western indulgence of the Palestinian dream has obstructed the path to peace. A very relevant topic nowadays, especially in the light of the upcoming Israeli government, which hopefully will be installed soon. I personally have read the Hebrew version directly after it was published 2 years ago already. And as I said, try to engage Einat to come and talk about it since then. Einat, thanks again for coming and joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ghana and Sidi, for having me. It's really a pleasure, even if only virtually, to be visiting you in the Netherlands. So it's an honor to present today my latest book, co-authored with Adi Schwartz, titled The War of Return. And I want to give a bit of background as to why did the topic even interest me and why did I decide to write the book. So growing up in Israel, politically, I was very much a part of what was known as the Israeli peace camp, the Israeli left, the Israeli Labor Party. Certainly as a young adult, I was very much associated with the politics of the Labor Party, which in the 1980s and later in the 1990s with Shimon Peres, with Rabin, became very much associated with a very simple formula. It had the elegance of simplicity. It was almost mathematical, and it was known as the land for peace formula. The idea was that Israel has a clear path to peace, very simple. All that Israel has to do is to hand over land. The land it acquired as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War, the Sinai Peninsula in the south, the Golan Heights in the north, and in the center, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So this was a very simple idea. Israel will hand over land, Israel will get peace. And for a while, this really seemed to work beautifully. As a young girl, I was taken out of my elementary school in Jerusalem to wave at flags for the motorcade of President Anwar Sadat as he was passing on his way to the Israeli Knesset, to our parliament in Jerusalem. Now, a lot of people forget what a big deal that was. Anwar Sadat headed Egypt, our mightiest enemy, the country that only 4 years earlier went to war with us. It was a terrible, bloody war. We lost many of our best people. There was a sense that Israel was going to not survive the Yom Kippur War of 1973. And only 4 years after that, Anwar Sadat comes to Jerusalem. He speaks in the Knesset and he speaks of peace. And within 2 years, he gets the entire Sinai Peninsula to the last square centimeter. So land for peace. Egypt signs a peace agreement with Israel. Egypt gets the Sinai Peninsula, twice the size of Israel, no settlements, it gets everything. So over 40 years since the agreement with Egypt, we can have an interesting discussion as to whether what we have with Egypt should be properly called peace. But at the time, this seemed very simple. Land for peace. The 1990s were all about land for peace. Now it's hard to remember the sense of euphoria at the time. There was really almost a sense of a domino of peace. We're negotiating with Syria over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan once Jordan gave up its territorial claim to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight was we were negotiating with the PLO, with the Palestinians, over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. This was dramatic, and really at that time, I remember it as a time of euphoria. The major year, the 1990s, culminate in the year 2000. Ehud Barak, the leader of the Israeli Labor Party of the peace camp, goes to Camp David. And Camp David is symbolic. This is where we negotiated peace with Egypt. He goes to Camp David and he puts a proposal on the table. The proposal tells the Palestinians they can have a fully independent state in the West Bank and Gaza. No settlements in sight. They will control the territory. They will control the borders. The capital will be in East Jerusalem, including part of the old city. People forget now how far-reaching this proposal was. It ticked all the boxes of what we were told was needed to get to peace, ending the occupation, no settlements, a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza. Everything was checked. And what happened? Arafat walks away. President Clinton presents his parameters and he walks away. This repeats itself in 2008. Ehud Olmert, leading then the Israeli peace camp, puts the same proposal, even more far-reaching, but the same principles, and Abu Mazen walks away. This was weird. Land for peace. We were offering land. Where was our peace? We were putting on the table everything that should have brought us peace, everything we were told that the Palestinians wanted. And not only did they walk away from that, what followed was this bloody, murderous campaign, maybe some of you remember it, of 2001, 2, 3, of the bloody massacres in our streets. People were blown up to bits. Families for going to pizzeria, for having a Seder. People would board buses and would be blown to bits. I remember that in Israel. For me, it was the darkest time to live in Israel. I mean, there was really this fear that if you just left your home, you didn't know if you'd come back. So the question for me and for my co-writer and for many, many Israelis of the peace camp was, what's going on? What do the Palestinians want? They could have had a state, fully independent, capital, no settlements. They could have had a state. Why are they killing us in Tel Aviv if they could have just had their own state in the West Bank and Gaza. And during that time, I began to meet with Palestinians who were presented to me as moderate Palestinians, and I began to research. And I realized that their vision of the conflict and my vision were completely different. I and the entire Israeli peace camp believed that this was a conflict over territory and all the things that are related to territory, the settlements, occupation, borders, the Palestinian state. I realized from their perspective, they were focused on something entirely different, something that they called the right of return. And just to explain a bit what this is. For the Palestinians, the thing they call the right of return is they believe a right which every Palestinian possesses. They count 8, sometimes 9 million Palestinians who they claim have that right. Another number is 5.5 million Palestinians who are registered by an agency called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which continues to register by now into the 5th generation, Palestinians who've escaped the war of 1948 as refugees from that war. Even though by now millions of them have been born after the war, they've never been to the war, they've never been in Israel. So whether it's the 5.5 million that UNRWA registers or the 9 million that the Palestinians claim, they believe that all of them possess a right to settle inside the state of Israel, which means not in the West Bank and Gaza. They don't consider that a right of return. Inside Israel in its pre-1967 ceasefire lines. If you know the numbers, the influx of millions of Palestinian Arabs into Israel with Israel's substantial Palestinian Arab minority would mean that the Jewish people become a minority in an Arab state. And I realized that from the perspective of the Palestinian, that is what they expect to be. I realized from their perspective, the war of 1948, the war that followed the United Nations plan to divide the land between a state for the Jewish people and a state for the Arab people, that the outcomes of this war, the fact that the state of Israel was established when the war was done, was unacceptable, and that they still believed that the war is not over. Now, as I researched this issue more, the idea of the right of return, the Palestinian attachment to the idea of the right of return, I realized that they're incredibly serious about it. It's not as certain negotiators and diplomats believed in the 1990s that this was a bargaining chip, that the Palestinians claim this right of return because it's their only asset, and they're going to give it up once they can have the asset of the territory of the West Bank and Gaza. But if this were true, let's say this was the assumption in the 1990s, the peace offers of 2000 and 2008 should have put an end to it. Because rather than bargaining away the right of return in order to achieve a sovereign state in the territory of the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinians actually bargained away a Palestinian state in order to keep fighting for the right of return, in order to not sign any agreement which would say that there is no right of return. And of course, any agreement with Israel would have to say that, because the thing is this, the right of return is not really a right. It is not recognized in international law. We explain this in the book. As much as the Palestinians want to claim it, there is no basis for the idea, and it doesn't exist, that a people, an entire people, possess a right, an internationally sanctioned right that overrides the sovereignty of another state. Basically, the Palestinians claim that they have a right to settle inside Israel, which Israel cannot resist, which Israel cannot oppose. this flies in the face of the entire international system, which is why it's not a right. The entire international system is based on the sanctity of the sovereignty of the state, and that a state can have the right to determine who enters its borders and who does not. And there is nowhere in international law the notion that an entire people possess a right that violates the sovereignty of another nation. And precisely because it's not a right, the Palestinians repeatedly demand that any agreement with Israel recognize the right. They want any agreement with Israel to have written inside it that Israel recognizes that the Palestinians have a right of return into the state of Israel. Again, something that is not supported by international law. And I don't know of any country in the world that would agree to give another people, certainly people who've been at war with it, but any people for that matter, a right to settle inside the country without limit, without having any kind of say in it, because it's a right. So the Palestinian demand that any agreement with Israel accept that such a right exists and that all the Palestinians possess it. And of course, they always tone down and they say, but don't worry, most of us are not going to exercise it. And one of the things we show in the book, that they have every intention of exercising it. They speak of millions doing so. And even so, even if they don't exercise it tomorrow morning, who's to vouch for the state of Israel that they're not going to do it in 10 years? Circumstances change. So what we realize is this: first, the Palestinians are incredibly serious about this. They're so serious that they're willing again and again to give up having their own sovereign state in part of the land, if this means signing an agreement with Israel where there is no recognition of the right of return. And they're not going to get such an agreement for the obvious reasons I mentioned. But really what shocked me is I tried to ask myself, Adi and I asked ourselves, how did the Palestinians even get to the point where they think they have this right? How is it that we have millions of people who believe that they are refugees from a war that ended more than 70 years ago, who believe that they have a right to settle in a country in which they've never been? How did that happen? And one of the things we discovered, actually the thing we discovered, is that the Palestinians were indulged in a policy that no other refugee population got. None. What we saw is that throughout the 20th century, you have vast amounts of refugees. Over the 20th century, hundreds of millions. And the reason is obvious. The 20th century is a political transition from empire to nation state. We begin the 20th century and almost all of the earth is divided between empires. We end the 20th century when almost all of the earth is divided between nation states. And in the interim are bloody wars of this transition. In the process, as empires collapse, nations are established, nations fight over borders, people rise to claim their territory. What happens in this bloody process is hundreds of millions of refugees they flee, they're expelled, they're pushed out. You have all means of atrocities all around the world. And today, our people from wars of the first half of the 20th century and even after our war of 1948, in the 50s, in the 60s, are they still refugees today? No. Why? Why do we not have millions, hundreds of millions of refugees across Europe, across Africa, across Asia? Because everywhere in the world, the message to refugees was tough but clear. Move on. You might have lost homes, war is terrible, war is brutal, but you're not going back. Going back only means that the war continues. You either settle where you are and build your new future or go somewhere else. But what is lost, and it's over. This is the message that Hindus and Muslims heard in India and Pakistan. This is the message of numerous refugees across Europe, especially 12 million Germans who were brutally expelled from Poland, from the Czechoslovakia after they already surrendered. And they were expelled. They didn't come back. They're not refugees. They don't have their own agency. South Korea, millions of refugees were settled. They didn't go back. All across Africa, everywhere. Only the Palestinians were set up in a way that basically told them, you know what? Sure. Keep remaining as refugees until, in your mind, you will finally roll back 1948. You will return. Palestinians did not get the message that all other refugees got, which said, move on. If they had gotten that message, the world would be a very different place. I want to read to you one of my favorite paragraphs from the book that basically kind of tries to describe what the world today would have looked like if all the refugees in the world would have been treated like the Palestinian refugees. So if the criteria UNRWA uses to register Palestinian refugees, generation after generation, the fact that even if they're citizens, they're still refugees. So if these criteria were used to the rest of the world's population, there would not be just 20 million refugees that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that's the UN body that deals with all the refugees in the world except the Palestinians, there would not just be the 20 million that the UNHCR counts today. Rather, a large share of the world's population, hundreds of millions of people, would be considered refugees still. Worse, the result of such refugee perpetuation policies would have been a world stuck in a backward-facing mode, refusing to take any steps towards a new future. South Korea would still be the wasteland it was after the Korean War. I'll tell you, after the Korean War, South Korea was far more devastated than the situation of the Palestinians. But they settled, and UNCRA, the agency that was established for the Koreans, closed down, just like UNRWA was supposed to do after it settled the Palestinian refugees. And look at South Korea today, and look at the Palestinians. So imagine what South Korea would have been like if the South Korean refugees would have been treated like the Palestinians. On both sides of the India-Pakistan border, tens of millions of refugees would sit seething, generation after generation, continuing to claim the other country as their own. Imagine that. The United States would be deprived of much of its energy and become a country of refugees who refuse to build a future in it while constantly looking back to their mythologized previous lives, or actually to those of their great-grandparents. Hundreds of millions of refugees in Africa and Europe would sit in camps, nurturing resentments and fantasies of revenge, and no single nation's borders would be settled. Had the people in the rest of the world been registered as refugees in the same manner as UNRWA does for Palestinians, the long peace that has marked much of the world since the end of World War II would have been replaced by constant war. And this is precisely the message. The Palestinians were indulged by the Western and international community in allowing to continue to keep the war alive. And this is why we still have a conflict. If to be really, really simple, if we are ever to have peace, the war must end. As long as the Palestinians are nurtured in their view that the war of 1948 is still open, and that one day they will roll it back via the mechanism of return, then of course we're never going to have peace. Of course they're never going to sign anything. And what we really detail in the book is the high price that we paid in continued wars, in terrorism. We show how the terrorists of the Munich massacre, how the terrorists of many of the plane hijackings of the 70s, of the 80s, they were all children of the UNRWA refugee camps. This is where they were nurtured in their idea of revenge, of resentment, that they were done a unique injustice that had to be corrected. There's a quote of someone from Fatah in our book who says, Fatah can only train one person at a time, but UNRWA trains the hearts of the masses. This is what the international community has allowed to build for over 70 years. And what Adi and I are calling in the book to do is basically to stop that. We say that if we are ever to have peace, we can no longer indulge this idea. The Palestinians have to get the same message that the Koreans and the Germans and every other refugee group in the world got, which was move on, build your new lives. There's no right of return. It's not a right. It's not a return by now. So it's over. The war is over, and move on with your lives. So we say that this is still a book of peacemakers. This is still a book of the peace camp. But this time we understand that in order to make peace, we must first end the war. We all just mark VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Before Europe could enjoy its peace, the war had to end. In the same way, if we are to finally enjoy peace, the war has to end. And countries like Holland, which fund UNRWA every year, should stop doing so and should finally send a message to the Palestinians, it's over. We're more than welcome to give you money, but we're not going to give you money to sustain the idea that the war of 1948 is still open and that one day you will return to a state that is not yours. So let me stop here, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Einat. I want to start with the last thing you mentioned, the financing. What you're saying, if I understand you well, is you're calling the world to stop financing UNRWA. What do you suggest they do?
So first, just to understand a bit of the background, UNRWA is still, after 70 years, a temporary agency. UNRWA just tweeted on its account that it's proud to celebrate 70 years. This is the least thing to be proud of. If they should have been proud to close more than 60 years ago, just like UNCRA, having settled everybody. UNRWA is proud to still be a temporary agency after 70 years. It's still temporary. The UN General Assembly still has to renew its mandate every 2-3 years. Because it's temporary, it doesn't have its own budget. It's not an organ of the UN. So it needs to get separate funding every year from several donor countries, which are almost all Western. For most of UNRWA's years, it was the US. The US started defunding UNRWA a couple of years ago. So now it's Europe. Whether the EU or countries like Sweden, the Netherlands, the UK, Germany, they're funding UNRWA. The number is $1 billion. $1 billion goes every year to UNRWA, mostly for schools and healthcare. But really, what the $1 billion a year does is keep this organization, which tells the Palestinians that the war of 1948 is not over, it keeps it alive. So what we're saying is, you want to give money to the Palestinians, please, by all means. You want to give double that amount, triple that amount, please. But don't give it to the one organization that makes sure that the conflict will last forever, especially for a country like the Netherlands, and I think all Western countries. The official policy of the Netherlands is that it supports a two-state solution. Well, how exactly does it make sense to give money to the one organization that makes sure that you will certainly fail? There will never be a two-state solution if Palestinians learn to prize return above everything else. They will never agree to two states. And in fact, all Palestinian leaders who said they support a two-state solution, Abu Mazen, even Arafat, they all said that the right of return is sacred. So if you say that you support a two-state solution and the right of return, then the only two states you actually support are a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and a Palestinian state to replace Israel. It's not how I think the Netherlands envisions a two-state solution. So in the book, we have very detailed proposals of how to transfer the services of UNRWA, the schools, the healthcare, to the local providers. It's actually very easy. Almost half of the refugees live in Jordan as its citizens. Most of them, by the way, don't get UNRWA services. They're business people. They're not refugees. They don't live in camps. They're citizens of Jordan. Give the money to the Jordanian government. That's it. There's no reason to have UNRWA in Jordan. The Palestinians are citizens of Jordan. Nowhere in the world is someone a citizen of a country, born in that country, never displaced by war, and yet they're considered a refugee from a third country in which they've never been. So don't give the money to UNRWA, give the money to the Jordanian government. They perfectly know how to supply schools and healthcare. The same for the Palestinian Authority. The other 40%, almost half of the refugees, live in the West Bank and Gaza, under the Palestinian Authority, under Hamas. They're in Palestine. I mean, whatever your worldview, a Palestinian who is born in Ramallah or in Gaza, certainly by his sense, he lives in Palestine. So again, how is someone who was born in Palestine, lived there all their life, never displaced by war, and again, the vast majority, just like in Jordan, don't live in camps. So we're talking about a 30-year-old lawyer living in Ramallah, middle class, never displaced by war. He's registered as a refugee. Why give money to sustain that? Give money to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority already runs schools, healthcare, let it take it over. And then we have proposals for Lebanon and Syria, basically to either help them settle in Lebanon or Syria, or work with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee to resettle them elsewhere. But there are practical solutions as soon as you accept that the Palestinians are not special. If you use the same policies that were used for all refugees in the world, if you use the same standards, the solutions are actually quite direct and simple, and all the countries need to do is take their money out of UNRWA and give them to other causes that do not continue to fuel the conflict.
So I'm just taking a small break to tell our viewers, first of all, that we hope everybody is online now, because I understood there was a small technical problem in the beginning. I hope we have everybody on board now. I'm sure about that. But for those who did not hear the first words we said, I want to repeat the possibility, if you are on Zoom, to pose questions using the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. Going back to what you said, Einat, the Netherlands gives yearly at least 21 million euros to UNRWA. Say we could persuade the government they should use the money differently. What could you advise us to tell them to do with the money, not just giving to the Palestinian government, because we have some other issues like paying, terrorists and things. If you said, okay, you can earmark this money, what would be your proposal? Where you plan? 21 million, at least a year.
Okay, it's a lot of money. This is precisely our idea. Earmark it. Earmark it for schools. So for example, in the book, we say there's an X number of schools in the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank that are registered as that are UNRWA schools. We're saying for every 10 schools that the Palestinian Authority takes under its management. And the thing is, nothing has to change. The same building, the same students, the same teachers, only the sign on the door needs to change from UNRWA to the Palestinian Authority. Every school that is transferred to Palestinian Authority responsibility, earmark the money and hand over the money. So we have those proposals. Do it gradually until finally there are no UNRWA schools in the West Bank. The Jordanian government, basically tell the Jordanian government that you're pulling out. As I said, the vast majority, 82% of Palestinians who are registered as refugees don't even use UNRWA services. So just pull out and give Jordan money. Jordan is perfectly capable of doing schools and healthcare. In Syria and Lebanon, for example, we recommend using the money first and foremost to find out how many Palestinians are actually still in Syria and Lebanon. The amazing thing is that UNRWA registers about 1 million Palestinians, half in Syria, 500,000 Lebanon. We know that the vast majority are no longer in Syria and Lebanon. A recent census by Lebanon said that the number is probably a third, around 170,000, and even that number is declining. Syria, especially given what happened there in the last decade, is probably even lower. But UNRWA never, unlike UNHCR, UNRWA never takes anyone off its books. Just so someone might have left Syria or Lebanon, become a successful person in Germany or Sweden, got a Canadian citizenship, UNRWA would never take them off their books. One of my favorite examples is that the multi-millionaire father of the supermodels, Gigi and Bella Hadid, he lives in LA, but because he was born in Syria, he's still registered under UNRWA as a refugee from Syria. UNRWA did not go and say, okay, he's now a citizen of America, he has great life, we're taking him off the list. No, he's still on the list. So the first thing I would use the money, I would, if I'm the Netherlands and you can persuade them, is to go to UNRWA Syria and Lebanon and say, we want to know who is still in Syria and Lebanon. We want to get a proper accounting of the people. We want to know who has another citizenship because they should be stricken from the books. That, I think, will bring us to very low numbers. And then whether it's 100,000 or 200,000 or even 300,000 rather than 1 million, and I said the other 4.5 million are not even refugees, they're citizens of Jordan, they're living in the West Bank and Gaza. So those 300,000 could then be transferred to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for resettlement. We bring an example in the book of how the UNHCR normally operates. We bring an example of a conflict between Bhutanese and Nepalese. Who even heard about that conflict? In the 1990s. So initially UNHCR settles the refugees from the conflict in refugee camps, about 100,000 refugees. There are negotiations, efforts, blah, blah, blah. After 7 years, it's clear that they're not going back. Well, the UNHCR did not sit and tell the refugees from that conflict, it's really not okay that you cannot go back. We're now going to establish schools and healthcare for you for the next 70 years. It basically said, okay, this is over. We need to find a solution to these refugees. And within 10 years, all 100,000 are resettled in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Canada, the US, and it's over. That's it. So once you operate according to the international standards, even the 100,000, 200,000 who are still in Syria and Lebanon can finally be brought down to zero. And then that's it. In Jordan, they're not refugees. In Gaza and the West Bank, they're certainly not refugees. And in Lebanon and Syria, the numbers could be taken care of like they're taken care of internationally.
Regarding the Gaza and the West Bank, would you say that trying to transform the UNRWA position or the people under UNRWA to just becoming part of the administration they live under would help the Palestinian Authority to become on its way, on its path to becoming a better functioning free state?
Of course, our entire message is that every country in the world benefited from the tough but pragmatic message that said, move on, right? That was all the message, all the examples we have in the book, from Germany to South Korea. Look at how much they've prospered by not looking back, by looking to the future. So in the same way, we're saying, if the international community wants to nurture a Palestinian vision that is constructive, that is focused on building a state in the West Bank and Gaza, rather than what they're currently doing, which is sustaining a destructive vision that says, we don't want to build a state in the West Bank and Gaza, we want Israel, we want to return to Israel. Well, that's never going to bring peace. So by getting the Palestinians to close down the UNRWA services and basically take responsibility themselves is part of the process of getting them to move to a constructive vision of building a state for themselves in part of the land, rather than constantly waiting to return to the other part, which is the state of Israel.
Yeah, interestingly enough, the Palestinians who've become, who've lost their homes and have stayed in the within the Green Line, in the borders of the Israeli state, are not refugees anymore, even if they move to Haifa, Nazareth, or whatever. So that's an interesting parallel maybe to be taken. There is a question. There are some questions I want to ask you. The first one is, why did the world, and the West in particular, allow this situation?
So this was certainly our research question in the book. And what we've discovered is that it was a combination, but it really goes to the 1950s. In the 1950s, the Arab world is still very powerful. It's fairly united. The Arab League is a significant body. The world needs oil. It needs oil for the reconstruction of Europe. It needs oil to build America. The Arab world is important for oil. It's the Cold War. America and the West are deeply concerned about a Soviet takeover of the Middle East. So all of these things come together so that when the Arab world comes to the West, basically what we show in the book is throughout the 1950s, the US and the UK, who were funding UNRWA at the time, were really expecting UNRWA to resettle the refugees. In Jordan, Jordan controls the West Bank, most of the refugees are there. In Syria and Lebanon and the Gaza Strip, they expect what happened in Korea to happen with the Palestinians in the Arab world. It's the same language, it's the same people, it's the same ethnicity. Why should they not be absorbed? But what they realize is that within a few years, that this is useless. The Arab refugees themselves refuse to cooperate because they still want the war to continue. And the Arab countries refuse to cooperate because they still view the war as continuing. So basically, we see towards the second half of the 1950s, British and American ambassadors in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon are sending cables, we show them in the book, to the US and the UK saying, we need to close down UNRWA. This organization is useless. So already in the 1950s, they know that UNRWA is useless. They know that UNRWA is not achieving what Ankara did in 4 years and with much less money. So they want to close down UNRWA. And in the book, we tell of a scene where the Saudi ambassador comes to the US representing the Arab League and basically telling them, you don't want to do this. And essentially threatening them with economic sanctions if America closes down UNRWA. And again, this is a powerful Arab world. Oil is important. And there's a real fear that if any part of the Arab world is lost to the West, it will go to the Soviet bloc. So the West decides to cave in and basically to pay what becomes a bribe. They know that UNRWA is useless, but they think of it as a bribe to the Arab world. Basically a kind of whatever. We'll pay 50 million, 100 million, whatever it is, just so the Arab world will not be angry at us, especially under the Eisenhower doctrine. And from that moment, UNRWA basically enters into an inertia. No one ever questions it again. It just gets its mandate renewed every few years. It gets the money until President Trump decided to defund UNRWA. No one even questioned it. It just became this regular bribe, you know, just like in those movies where the store owner pays a regular bribe to the mafia, and that's it. They never rebel against it. So this was the case here. And what we hope to highlight in the book is that if the West had maybe something to fear from the Arab world 70 years ago, this is no longer the case. The Arab League is a shadow of its former self. Saudi is warming up to Israel, as well as other Gulf states. If you hear what the Saudi and the Gulf states are saying about the Palestinians, what I'm saying is gentle compared to what they're saying about the fact that they're not refugees and it's time to finish this. So even Saudi is beginning to move away from its more historical position. The importance of oil is not what it used to be. So we definitely think that UNRWA should have been closed 60 years ago, but better late than never. So we say now is certainly a good time to do it. There's no longer those same conditions that forced the West to cave in the 1950s.
There is another question regarding this, and you just mentioned the Trump administration. Do you think the Trump deal, which was presented a few months ago, will make any difference in that sense?
I genuinely don't think it matters. Our book was written precisely because we felt that everyone was thinking and writing about the wrong things. Settlements, occupation, borders, negotiations. These are important things, but they're not the core issue. The core issue, the most important issue, is the Palestinian vision that they possess this right of return. So, and this is why I especially emphasize Israel's peace proposals of 2000 and the Clinton parameters and the Olmert proposal of 2008. Because if the Palestinians walked away from those proposals because they didn't want to give up on the idea that they have a right of return, there's no peace proposal to which they will say yes. So our view is that it really doesn't matter. First, we need to get the Palestinians to move away, to understand that there is no right of return, that nobody thinks there's a right of return, that nobody supports them in that, to not fund UNRWA anymore. And then over time, can we finally hope to see a Palestinian leadership that will say yes to a peace plan that gives them a state. And I mean, once they do that, I would say that I'm in favor of going back to the Olmert and Barak proposals, more far-reaching than the Trump plan. But right now, it doesn't matter. There's no use making any plan, any proposal, until this issue is placed on the agenda, front and center, and is directly dealt with.
And there is a question regarding this. Is the question, do you think Palestinians' attitude towards this question has changed, is changing, younger generation attitude to it? Do you have any idea about that?
So we know, and we detail it in the book, there has been no change. This is incredibly consistent. What changes sometimes is the wording or the attitude, two-state with return. The younger generation now favors a one-state, but it's the same thing. And from their perspective, Palestine is from the river to the sea, and they have a right to settle in all of it. So whether they call it two states with return or whether they call it a one-state solution, which is the more popular vision of the younger generation, it's the same thing. So there's no change. We were looking, because we're making a pretty strong claim in the book, we're saying that this is the Palestinian ethos. Because a lot of people tell us, no, this can't be everybody. And we always tell them, show us one Palestinian NGO, show us one op-ed writer, a Palestinian who wrote something in an op-ed, who says enough, it's over, we will not have a right of return, we don't have the right, let's focus on building our state. You do not even have a single op-ed to say that. But in the book, we give an example. We say, okay, this is our situation right now, because for 70 years, the Palestinians were allowed to build an entire nation and people and infrastructure around the idea of return. But we give the example of the German refugees after World War II. As I said, 12 million Germans, after Germany surrenders, after the war, they're brutally expelled from Poland, from Western Poland, from Czechoslovakia, and from other countries. Now, they're no different from the Palestinians. They want to return. Their families have been in Western Poland for centuries. Some of them say, look, we were not Nazis. We were not in the war. You know, they didn't go and check everyone. They expelled all the Germans. And they say, but do they get return? And by the way, they even had a name for it, Heimkehr. They wanted a right of return. They had organizations. They lobbied for it. They had newspapers. Did anyone indulge them in that vision? Absolutely not. The world would have none of it. Why? Because the world knew that if Germans were to reclaim Poland, it's World War III. So the Germans were not indulged, unlike the Palestinians, in this view that they can return one day. What happens? In 1970, the German Chancellor Willy Brandt signs an agreement with Poland. Now, before that, Willy Brandt, as an opposition leader, he was sympathetic to the claims of the German refugees. But then he becomes chancellor, and in 1970, he signs an agreement with Poland, setting the Oder-Neisse line as the final border of Germany. And he gives a speech to the Germans, especially to the refugees. And in the book, we pretty much say, do a cut and paste from the Willy Brandt speech to a Palestinian leader, and we have peace. Because what does Willy Brandt tell the German refugees, the German people? He tells them, it's over. The lands of Western Poland have been gambled a while ago. They're not ours anymore. And what I'm saying is not surrender, it's merely common sense. And we need to look to the future rather than to the past. So it took 25 years from the end of World War II until a Willy Brandt emerged to finally end the issue. And we even discovered that after the unification of Germany, Helmut Kohl wanted a return. And of course, the US told him, absolutely not, forget about it. So this is the same message we want the Palestinians to hear. So that perhaps in 25 years, hopefully earlier, a Palestinian Willy Brandt will emerge who will tell his people the same thing. It's over. We're not surrendering. It's merely common sense. The lands that are now the state of Israel are not ours. We need to look to the future. And that's exactly what we're hoping to achieve in the long term by changing the policy.
Well, we don't have much time, so I will only pose a last question. There is a very long question here, which I apologize. I can't just take the time to even read it now. So I will ask a more actual question, which is, what's that's the intention of the coming government of Israel to annex the settlements? Does it complicate the matter, or does it make no difference at all?
In the real core of the issue, it makes no difference. It might not be a good policy or a smart policy, or we can debate that. But first of all, one of the things that's important, it's a reversible policy. Just like people talked about Israel giving actual sovereign territory in an agreement with the Palestinians. So that in itself doesn't matter. Israel can annex and de-annex in the future if there's a chance for peace. The core issue, and this is what we insist on in the book, is this idea of a Palestinian right of return. In many ways, one of the reasons that annexation might lead people to think that that's the problem, and certainly doesn't help, but that's not the issue. As I said, Palestinians walked away from the Barak proposal, from the Clinton parameters, from the Olmert proposal. They walked away when they were told that they can have the entire West Bank with the Jordan Valley and no settlements and land swaps. It was going to be 100% equivalent of the territory. They were going to get a capital in East Jerusalem. There was not going to be any settlement anywhere in the Palestinian state that Barak and Clinton and Olmert offered. And they still walked away. If anything, what the book helps to understand is why today Israel is basically a country of the center. The current Israeli government represents what Israelis have realized after the whole process that I'm describing, that there's no amount of land, except for all of it, but there's no amount of land which Israel can give in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, if Israel were to commit suicide, that's fine, but there's no amount of land in the West Bank and Gaza which Israel could give and to which the Palestinians would say yes, because they still want the right of return into the state of Israel. So what we're saying is, stop writing peace proposals. It doesn't matter. And understand that Israelis today know that it doesn't matter. Israel will agree to compromise if things change. But the reason that we no longer believe in land for peace, and this is why I started with this belief, the reason that we no longer believe in land for peace is that we tried it. We were willing to hand over the land and we didn't get peace. We actually just got massacres. So most Israelis today are in the center, which means they're saying, look, we don't want to control the Palestinians in the West Bank. Absolutely not. We want to have our own state where we control ourselves. But we also don't see how we can peacefully get out of the West Bank. We tried to get unilaterally out of Gaza. Rather than building Gaza into a Singapore, they made it into a launch pad of rockets. So we cannot peacefully get out of the West Bank with an agreement. We tried to get out with an agreement, but there's no agreement short of Israel's suicide, which the Palestinians would say yes to. So we need to change that. And the only way to change that is if the Palestinians, like the Germans, like the South Koreans, like everybody else, would hear from everyone, the Arab world and the West, that it's over, that the war is over. And now that the war is over and they accept the outcomes, they can now make peace and begin to build their own future.
Will there be peace in our time?
So here and in the book, I always like to quote Chazal, the Jewish sages, who say that we may not be the ones to finish the job, but that doesn't mean that we will not do the job. So I don't know if it will happen in my lifetime, but I see myself and I see this book as an effort of a peacemaker to make sure that it happens sooner rather than later. When? Who knows? But but I'm trying to make it sooner rather than later.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, and I apologize everybody who posed a question which I could not pose to you. I want to thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. I hope people who have more questions will find the answers in the book. And I hope to see you again in the next lecture regarding our aspects of the Israeli society, which is a fascinating society. And I do hope we will all see peace in our lifetime. I think we all crave for that. I thank you, the public, for joining us. I want to remind you that through our websites, you can find information about more coming up events. We will have another event in May and some in June. And you're all welcome to join us, and you're all welcome to send us questions in advance. It's often easier for me to manage all these questions. And again, thank you very much, Einat. Thank you all public. Have a very nice evening, and I hope we can see each other in person very soon.
I'd like that. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.